It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I am your host this morning. Appreciate you riding along with us. For those of you that are joining us on the web, I see you out there. Thanks for staying with us this morning. Boy, there's a lot of folks out there this morning. I see Baton Rouge. I see Hopkinton, Lincoln, Branson, West Plains, Grandview, Mission Viejo. Did I say that right? No insult intended, Mission Viejo. We are looking at some difficult scenarios this morning. One, there's some news and information out there about the Farm Bill. We're going to talk a little bit about that and how the Farm Bill has basically become a slush fund for tyrants and tyranny. For those of you that don't know about it, the Farm Bill is rampantly pouring literally billions of dollars into the hands of very, very wealthy individuals. And what's even more disturbing is that I don't know if you knew it or not, but Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam are farmers in Chicago, no less. Did you know? Did you know that Farrakhan was a farmer? And that he is, along with 10,806 other recipients, each getting between $250,000 and $420,000 a year? Wow. In Chicago, no less. I mean, how cool is that to be a farmer in the middle of downtown Chicago? What a scam. All right, so we're going to tackle that. Second topic is going to be the budget deal. You know, I listened to Paul Ryan last night. I listened to a couple of interviews with him about it. This is the new budget deal that he worked up. I got to tell you, to me, it sounds like just another Ponzi scheme. The price goes up, the spending goes up, but they cut the amount of the growth of spending and call that good. Hey, folks, we're bankrupt. Sitting there and saying, well, you know, listen, we're going to trim spending down a little bit when you're already spending 500% more than you make is absurd. You wouldn't do that in your home, and I don't know how you could classify that and you wouldn't do that in your business, so I don't know how you think you can get away with it in government. But for whatever reason, apparently they do. I mean, it's beyond my comprehension. Our third topic, EPA. The Environmental Protection Agency has, at least for today, become the most dangerous agency in America. I'm going to explain why when we talk about that, but I got to tell you, the EPA is expanding their reach to incorporate all the water and have control over all water in the United States. Now, I've talked about this before, so if I'm beating a dead horse for you, that's fine, but there's some things that you need to know about this. And so I'll encourage you to ride along with us for that segment. But this is a dangerous trend, and a lot of people are talking about it, even in government, but the media is keeping a blackout on it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that's typical. The Ministry of Propaganda is hard at work keeping you blinded from the truth and reality. And that's never good. Our fourth topic is going to be the police state in America. The tragedy of militarization. There's a couple of stories I'm going to go over with you, including one about how a woman's home was raided in New York, and the New York Police Department went in, beat up her family. They stomped her pet parakeet to death. Oh, and by the way, all charges were dropped, and the judge sealed the file so that nobody could find out exactly what was really going on. This is like Stasi, East Germany. We're also going to review a story in Mother Jones News, which I'm not a big fan of Mother Jones generally, but when it comes to things like, this stuff and militarization of the police state, they do make some very good points. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let's hit on our first topic. Between 2008 and 2011, the Farm Bill has been giving away roughly $6.25 million in federal farm subsidies to several groups in just the Chicago area alone. One of them is a charity owned by Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. And I got to tell you, there's a watchdog group out there that put out a report about this called OpenTheBooks.com. And basically they're stating that the farm subsidies are going to the big dogs who are either cronies of the federal administration or fundraisers of the administration, the kind of people who package up these donor packages where they walk in there and they hand Obama a check for a couple of $1 million to run for re-election, etc. Several of the entities in Chicago got federal subsidies at their downtown Loop office buildings or their residential mansions. Nearly every neighborhood in the city receives federal farm subsidy payments. This is in Chicago now, including the Gold Coast, downtown, the Loop, Lincoln Park, and even the president's neighbors in Hyde Park. 930 entities are sharing $6 million. And as for the Louis Farrakhan Group, 3 years Economics Savings, Inc., which is listed as his home address, received approximately $103,000 between 2008 and 2011. You see, the problem here, folks, is that the Farm Bill, and by the way, the remainder of the Farm Bill, 80% of it is food stamps. So if 80% is food stamps, and then all of this other money is being used to pay off cronies who really are not farmers, what's the rest of it actually being used for? Billions of dollars is going to farm subsidies of 10,806 recipients. There's a grand total of 10,806 between 2008 and 2011. Each of them received an average of $417,000. Now, the truth of the matter is, the actual people who are getting the money are not farmers. I mean, I could understand if they were paying a farmer out in the middle of rural Missouri. But to be honest with you, one, that's not even government's role. And two, the problem is that when we're talking about these farm subsidies, they're going to people who own a piece of property and they're paid not to grow anything on it. You know, the reality is that these farm subsidies that are issued out today, and the literally hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending in farm subsidies, have absolutely zero to do with farming. They have nothing to do with family farming, that's for sure. The only entities that gain money from this are enterprise farmers. We're talking about the major players in the farming and food industry. These are the people that, for all intents and purposes, are not individuals. They are large megalithic corporations, and they're getting literally billions of dollars in payoffs. Now, that's because they can afford to spend millions of dollars lobbying Congress to get what they want. The small family farm received only a tiny fraction of the total of federal subsidies that were associated with the Farm Bill. Wealthy investors are the ones who actually get it. And they have made this a part of their portfolio in their farming industry, farming business. They don't live in rural areas. They put a farm manager on a piece of property they own, and the taxpayer dollars that are used maximize the return on their, quote, farm investment, where nothing is actually grown. You see, the truth of the matter is that what we have at this point in time is a system where everybody is, well, let me clarify it for you this way. What we really have is a system where the best businesses in America right now are those industries and businesses which have figured out how to make money on the federal government. That's the fastest, most positive growth industry in America. How to get money from the federal government. 10% of the total proceeds of this, 10% of the total recipients account for 74% of all the money doled out annually. Can you believe that? So the top 10% of these farmers, which, by the way, are all, none of them are family farms, not a single one, and they account for or receive 74% of all of the money that is passed out. Now that is literally criminal. I mean, when I say criminal, I mean criminal. The truth is, the farm subsidy should be ended. The farm bill should never come to pass. Because what the farm bill really is a giveaway. It's a slush fund for tyrants. And it's a slush fund for their cronies and their friends. And it's a slush fund to continue to encourage government tyranny over the American people. We live in a world now, ladies and gentlemen, and I hate to tell you, but if you're not aware of it, we're in a police state. It's an active, functional police state. That's where we are. You can deny it, you can pretend it's not true, but it doesn't make it so. We are living in a time and in a place where, for all intents and purposes, everything that is happening in America right now is geared towards your enslavement and your subjugation and digging out from you all of the revenue that they can get. The goal is to break the back of middle America. And when I say middle America, I don't mean geographically. I mean the upper middle class families all the way down to the poorest. Completely and utterly decimate them so that we have two levels of castes, if you will. We want to have a caste that is the upper elite. These are the multimillionaires, the multi-billionaires. When I say multimillionaires, I'm talking hundred millionaires. The super elite, the super wealthy. The people who buy a yacht and never go visit it. And we're talking about everybody else will be subjugated down to peasantry status. And what's being built to enforce that is organizations like the Department of Homeland Security, where in Obama, in his own words, he told us before he was ever elected, for national security purposes, we need an entity domestically here in the United States that is just as strong, just as well funded and just as well equipped as our military overseas. And that's essentially what he's building, the Department of Homeland Security. And underneath the Department of Homeland Security lies 100 other agencies. They are the state police, the secret police, the KGB, if you will, the SS of the United States of America. Now, the Department of Homeland Security, if you're not aware of it, has actually created something called Constitution-free zones. Now, I've talked to you before about this. In fact, I talked about this in specificity related to corporations and wondering why these corporations are not concerned about the fact that if you live within 100 miles of any of the borders of the United States, the external borders, we're talking about the border from Seattle all the way across Canada to the tip of Maine, all the way from Maine down to the tip of Florida, all the way across the Gulf, all the way to the tip of Mexico. The tip of southern Texas, and then all the way up along the Mexican border, and then all up along the western border of California and Oregon and Washington State. Think of 100 miles from every external border of the United States, and that is what the Department of Homeland Security actually calls the Constitution-free zone, which means that If you are within that 100-mile radius border, which, by the way, accounts for about 197 million people, right? That's 2/3 of the United States population. They can literally go in and pick you up off the street, take your laptop, go through it, look at anything they want, because the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply by the DHS's own admission and statements. The border includes anywhere where the United States land meets an ocean or borders another nation, including Mexico and Canada, obviously. It includes New York City. It includes Washington and the entire district around it. It includes the cities of Miami. It includes Houston. It includes L.A. It includes Philadelphia. It includes Portland. Any of these major cities that are within 100 miles of water on either coast fall up underneath this. Corpus Christi is part of it. San Antonio is part of it. The entire state of Florida is completely encompassed by it, and it runs all the way up into Atlanta and so forth. And the reason why is because Florida is not even 100 miles across. So basically, the entire state of Florida is a Constitution-free zone, according to the Department of Homeland Security. Now, this is not this is the ACLU coming out and saying this in concert with the Department of Homeland Security. Now, the ACLU is the ones who are fighting against it. But here's my point. When did you ever hear the term Constitution-free zone by the media? Has anybody in any of the news networks talked to you about this? Have you read about it in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Miami Herald, the Philadelphia Inquirer? Have you heard about this anywhere in any newspaper? No. Have you heard about it in your local newspapers? No. Have you heard about it on any of the television stations? Did you hear about it on Fox News? No. Did you hear about it on communist news? CNN? No, you didn't hear it there either. You didn't hear it on MSLSD. You didn't hear it on NBC, ABC, and CBS. The reason you don't is because they've been told not to tell you. And they are doing what they're the bidding of their masters. And when you talk about the abuse that's going on here with things like the Farm Bill, and for the record now, the last Farm Bill they tried to come out with was $800 billion, of which 80%, $800 billion, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, that's as big as the TARP fund was. Remember the big TARP fund that we had for the collapse in 2008? $875 billion. We're going to bail the banks out. They pissed it all away. We've got nothing to show for it. The Farm Bill is $800 billion. And 80% of that is food stamps. That's about $600 billion. $600 billion for food stamps. I mean, that's a staggering number. I grant you it covers over a period of years. But even if it's 10 years, that's $60 billion a year in food stamps. For a lot of people who, quite honestly, are really not necessarily in need of them, they're just scamming and gaming the system. And when you combine that with what's going on here in these Constitution-free zones, the militarization of our law enforcement systems across the planet, or across the country, when you combine that with what I talked to you about with the other day, with the ATF going off rogue and running amok across the country, you got to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, where this is headed. We are in a position where our nation is living under what I would term to be soft tyranny. Soft tyranny means they haven't yet come to the point where they're kicking in your doors and they're literally pulling you out of bed in the middle of the night and pointing a gun in your wife's face and telling her to shut up. That's hard tyranny. But make no mistake about it. On the path we're at, the soft tyranny cannot lead anywhere but to hard tyranny. Because the more Americans recognize what's going on around you, and I include in that the NSA revelations about all the spying that's going on. I mean, what do you think they're doing all that for? To catch a terrorist? Come on, man. You can't actually believe that. Can you? I mean, I really hope that our listeners are not gullible enough to fall for that. Because the argument that they're going to do this to catch some kind of a terrorist who may or may not kill 3 people in Boston, who they missed, obviously, is so preposterous, it's embarrassing. They're building enemy lists, and they're using the Obamacare system to gather data. They're using the NSA and the FBI to gather data. They're using the Department of Homeland Security to gather data. Now, it's okay for them to search you anywhere along the Mexican border for 100 miles. They can pull you over and say, give me that laptop, give me that cell phone, give me that camera. I'm going to look. But they can't catch a single illegal alien, right? I mean, don't you smell the joke of it, folks? You are being set up right now, every one of us. We are all being set up to be turned into peasantry who will be told what to do. I posted an article this morning up on our Facebook page about New York City and how the mayor of New York, Bloomberg, there's a protest planned because he's pushing for mandatory flu vaccines. Excuse me? Mandatory? I mean, what if I don't want a flu vaccine? Doesn't really matter. You got to have one. It's against the law not to get one. Since when? What if I don't want your stupid flu vaccine? What if I want to have a sugary drink that's more than 16 ounces? You see, that's the problem. This is the statist mentality. And they don't care what we think. What their attitude is, we'll tell you what we're going to do, and you're going to like it, even if you don't. If we want your opinion, we'll tell you what it is. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have become, in fact, I'm going to read you a quote from John Adams because I think it perfectly addresses this issue. Fear is the foundation of most governments. Wow. I'm not done, but that's just the opening sentence. So you can imagine what's coming. Fear is the foundation of most governments, but it is so sordid and brutal a passion and renders men in whose breasts it predominates so stupid and miserable that Americans will not be likely to approve of any political institution which is founded on it. I give you the Department of Homeland Security. I give you the NRO, National Reconnaissance Organization. I give you the Department of the NSA. I give you the IRS. I give you the Department of Border Patrol. I give you Commerce Department. I give you the EPA. Really? I give you the IRS. Fear is the foundation of most governments, but it is so sordid and brutal a passion, and it renders men in whose breasts it resides and predominates so stupid and miserable that Americans will not be likely to approve of any political institution founded upon it. Well, guess what? Every one of those 3-letter initials I read you is founded on fear as the foundation of their existence. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to America's Voice Now. When we come back, we're going to touch on the budget deal, how it's another Ponzi scheme to just continue to suck resources out of the American population. Find us on the web at americasvoicenow.org, facebook.com/America's Voice Now. And please hit the like button. We'll be right back. All right. Took a little break there. Got you a little snack. That's the beautiful part of radio. Doesn't cost you a penny. Your total compensation for listening to radio is getting a couple of ads. And unlike mass media, most of the ads are not designed to indoctrinate you. Have you ever noticed, by the way, before I get into this budget deal, have you ever noticed that when you're watching television, the total number of ads out there for medical products, and when I say medical products, I'm talking about drugs. Big Pharma is advertising these drugs on television that, are supposed to cure this or cure that or assist you in reducing your cholesterol or reducing your need for insulin or whatever their stupid nonsense is. Help you not go to the bathroom in your pants and every other crazy knuckle-headed thing out there. But if you ever listen to the list of things that can go wrong, they're actually worse than the original problem you have. I mean, I saw an article one time for this stuff that was for toenail fungus. And I thought to myself, well, I'm really not sure that calls for taking a pill. But when I heard the list of things that were contradictions that were associated with this, one of them actually or one of the problems that people had with this during the testing was renal failure. Now, renal failure is when your kidneys quit working, and that means you die. And I can't imagine you having toenail fungus that requires that you take the risk of dying in order to fix it by destroying your kidneys. I mean, really, the absurdity of it is just outside the scope of reality. It's indoctrination, ladies and gentlemen. Everything you watch, everything that you're seeing on television, whether you're watching, and I don't care if you're watching those Duck guys or the Duck Dynasty thing or whatever, I don't watch any of that. You know why? Because I refuse to subject myself to being indoctrinated. I mean, it's no different than some horror movie you saw one time where they strap a guy into a chair and hold his eyes open with like toothpicks or whatever, and then they show him something on a screen that brainwashes him. It's the same thing. You've allowed yourself, and you're allowing yourself every day to be fed that. And, you don't have to look far and wide to hear the old adage from Adolf Hitler and Goebbels, which was that given enough time, and the bigger the lie, the more people will begin to believe it. If you repeat it often enough, if the lie is big enough, and if you have enough time to consistently tell that lie over and over and over, people will begin to believe it. That's why you voluntarily sign your name to everything that's got a government form, because you're being told that you have to, and you believe that. What you're doing is you're entering into a contract with everything that you sign. That's why I tell you don't go to Obamacare and sign up, because you're entering into a contract. You're giving up your personal information, and you're giving up your privacy, and you're giving up your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination to go to Obamacare and get a piece of insurance that they've ordered you to do by law at the point of a gun. And I don't understand how America just doesn't grasp the concept that you cannot take a law as old as your right to privacy, as old as your right to not self-incriminate, as old as your right to free speech, which predates the Magna Carta. I mean, it goes all the way back to the first men that were thinking and sentient beings, right? And why you would be willing to give that up at the point of a gun based on a law they passed in 2010. So you're allowing a law passed in 2010 to completely obviate and force you to waive your rights that you've had since time immemorial, that were given to you by God and nature. Natural law. Very interesting, isn't it? All right, this topic that we're going to cover here is the new budget deal. Now, the problem with this budget deal, and this was done by Paul Ryan, and he's the representative, and Senator Patty Murray, and they've thrown out this budget proposal. And I listened to a few different interviews with Paul Ryan to kind of get a grasp on what he was going to do here. And this is very wonky stuff, folks. If you listen to this, it's like reading a math book to go to sleep. Puts you right out. The proposal, and it has to be voted on Thursday, by the way, basically what it does is it takes away the sequester. Now, the sequester was the biggest income or spending block that we've seen put in place in this country in the last 40 years. I know that it's hurt a lot of people who benefit from government, but it hasn't really caused you any harm whatsoever. You've probably barely even noticed. In fact, this may be the first time you've heard the word sequester at all. The truth is, the president used it as an excuse to stop touring kids through, kindergartners through the White House. and of course, he used it as an opportunity to punish the country. But the truth is that when you talk about reducing the increase in spending, that's all you're doing. You're reducing the increase, but you're not actually cutting any of the real, true spending. What you're saying is that instead of growing the budget at a rate of let's say an extra couple of $100 billion a year, you're only going to grow it at a rate of $20 billion a year, but it's still $20 billion increase over the year before. And we're already spending far more than we have. So what have you really accomplished? Well, that's the problem. You've accomplished nothing. If I said to you, listen, I know you make $40,000 a year, and you've got this $1 million mortgage, and you're really struggling to pay it because the total amount of money that you have to spend on $1 million mortgage, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, is costing you $5,000 a month. And you say, well, I only make $40,000, so that's not possible that I could have $5,000 a month because just to pay the mortgage, I've got to make $60,000 a year. And that means I haven't eaten. That means I don't have any other, I haven't put gas in my car, nothing. And that's where we are, ladies and gentlemen. And so I say to you, well, I'll tell you what. Go out and get yourself a second job, and that'll solve the problem. So you go to McDonald's and you find a job where you're going to make an extra $100 a month. Ladies and gentlemen, we're still not anywhere near approaching the resolution here. The resolution is you've got to get rid of that house and the stone around your neck that's costing you $5,000 a month because you're already $20,000 a year short. And to make an extra $1,200 a year is not going to anywhere near approach resolving your mortgage problem. You are upside down, period. End of story. And unless you dump that house, you are going down the tubes. And at some point, you're going to find yourself homeless. We are going to find ourselves homeless. In fact, we are already homeless. We have a scenario where right now, and I believe it was Jefferson that said it, and I'll pull it up. But basically what he said to us was that if we ever allowed the banks to determine how we were going to deal with financial issues, that, well, first of all, he said a private central bank issuing the public currency is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. We must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. But one of the things that he made very clear to us is that if we ever allowed the country to be ruled by banks, that we would wake up bankrupt and homeless on the shores in the nation that our forefathers conquered. And I'm paraphrasing that a little bit because I haven't memorized that particular quote. But you get the idea. The truth is that where we are right now is that no matter what they tell us they're going to do in this budget deal, it's a sham. There's no reality to this budget deal. All this is a scapegoat to kick the thing down the road a little while longer until all of these particular tyrants and traitors are out of office. But you see, every tyrant and traitor before them for the last 75 years has been doing the same thing. Now, Marco Rubio came out the other day, and he threw out his opposition against this thing. He opposes it. And here's what he said. We need a government with less debt and an economy with more good-paying jobs. And this budget fails to accomplish both goals, making it harder for more Americans to achieve the American dream. By the way, when you hear politicians talking like that and using words like the American dream and hardworking Americans, remember that you're being played. That's like the guy, that's like the girl, if you're a guy, or the guy, if you're a girl, who comes up and says how, witty and funny you are. And because you're getting buttered up, you're falling for the hook. If a guy walks up to a girl and he's got an ulterior motive, but he makes her feel good because he tells her how pretty she is, and then he tells her how intelligent that thing was she just said, and she starts to look at the guy in a different light. That's exactly what they're doing to you. They're telling you, we know you're a hardworking American, and we're working hard for you, to save you, to protect you. Government hasn't worked for the United States people in 75 years, folks. 120 years, actually, if you really want to get down to it. The last great president we had was Calvin Coolidge. I mean, really. Everybody else has been a tyrant. Coolidge was the only one who actually had the courage of his convictions to stand up and fight back against this stuff. Anyway, let me finish reading you Marco Rubio's quote. He is like Mario from Mario Brothers, right? These guys are such a joke. They're cartoonish because they're so easy to read between the lines. When they tell you something, it's so easy to see the sycophants in their statements. I mean, it really is embarrassing. We need a government with less debt and an economy with more good-paying jobs. No crap. How brilliant. And this budget fails to accomplish both goals, making it harder for more Americans to achieve the American dream. Instead, this budget continues Washington's irresponsible budgeting decisions by spending more money than the government takes in and placing additional financial burdens on everyday Americans. In the short run, this budget also cancels earlier spending reductions instead of making some tough decisions about how to tackle our long-term fiscal challenges caused by runaway Washington spending. I voted against sequestration because of its effect on key programs, including the defense budget. But higher spending and more revenue are not the appropriate ways to address the problem. The American people should not be asked to choose between a strong military and responsible budgets that encourage job creation and reduce debt. They deserve better than this. Well, I don't disagree with that statement. We do deserve better than this. But the problem is that the real crisis and the real crime here is that Paul Ryan is about to give up the one negotiating point, the one piece of strength we have, and that is the sequester. You see, the sequester forced budget cuts across the board. And it did it not saying, well, okay, this department actually is a good one, so let's just give them a little haircut. But this one over here is completely out of the control, so let's really chop their budget hard. It said across the board, everybody gets this cut, including the military, by the way. Now, look, I'm a big supporter of our military, but I'm not a supporter of our military hierarchy. They are just as wasteful, just as fraudulent, just as power-hungry and egomaniacal as the people in Washington, D.C. The Pentagon is just as bad as the Congress people. They're all looking for power and money and what's in it for me. When I say I support the military, I support the guys on the ground like D Company 1-8 Cav called the Reapers that are stationed in Afghanistan. These are the cats who haven't taken a shower in 6 weeks because they're living out there in the bush. That's who I support. And whether they're over there and they're over there for the right reasons or the wrong reasons or whatever, they went over there because they thought they were doing the right thing for their country. These top generals and these people in the highest echelons of our military, they know they're not doing the right thing for our country, and they couldn't give a rat's rear end. So when it comes time for sequester, when it comes time for across-the-board budget cuts, I say there are certain departments we can completely eliminate altogether. One of them is the Department of Education. It's $100 billion a year. The Federal Department of Education. By the way, for those of you who don't know, I live in a state of Missouri in which our state constitution says that the federal government cannot be involved in the education of our youth. And yet we receive the vast majority of our funding related to education from the federal government. And if you think that money doesn't come with strings, then you're really fooling yourself. But to make matters worse, the Constitution of the United States prohibits the federal government from being involved in schools. And yet they are. Why do we have a federal Department of Education then? It's an unconstitutional agency. Eliminated. $100 billion saved right there. Now, if you want to go out and spend it back on tanks and airplanes and, water bottles, fine. But I'm saying right off the bat, you got $100 billion saved by an agency that is anything but positive for America. You also have literally, let's take the food stamp program. You're talking about, even at the best estimate, $60 to $100 billion a year. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't people out there who need food stamps, but it's not the federal government's place to be doing that. If there's a state that has a problem feeding their people, then the state has to deal with that. But the truth of the matter is, if we stop spending so much or sending so much state money and tax revenue to the federal government, and the states had that money locally, they'd be able to deal with the problem themselves. But what we do now is we send all this money to Washington, they take the cut off the top, and then they send it back to us with strings. I mean, who would do that? Why would you put a middleman? I mean, all right, I'm going to give you a real simple analogy. You make $500 a week. You bring your paycheck, and you get it from work, and you go to bring it home. But before you get home, you've got to cash that paycheck, and you've got to pay $100 off the top. Then you get to keep the rest. Then your bank says to you, okay, so we've got our 100, and we're going to turn around and we're going to give this to you, but we're only going to give you 40 back. We're going to keep 60. And by the way, the 40 we give back to you, that 40 you're going to get says, if you want this 40, you've got to do something for us. Why would you do that? What would possess you to put a middleman between you and your home and your family? Now you come home to your wife, you got $400, and you got to wait a week for the bank to send you the other 40, which says, by the way, if you want this 40, you got to continue to come over here and take out the garbage for us and sweep our sidewalks. Really? Why would you do that? The truth is, we should stop spending or sending our money to Washington to have them turn right around and give it back to us, but with strings attached, and only give us back a portion of what we actually sent them in the first place. Meanwhile, they take a cut off the top and they distribute that amongst themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, if that happened in a non-governmental entity, it would be called the mafia. I mean, that is what it is. This is the thugocracy. And where we have fallen down is by allowing this to continue. We send $100 billion a year to the federal government to create the Department of Education, which in turn turns around and sends some of that money back to the states. It came from you in your state in the first place. Why don't you just have a higher state tax and no federal tax? Or very, very nominal, limited federal tax? You see, that's where the states have completely capitulated to the federal government. They don't tax you directly. They tax you a little bit in state income tax, but they don't tax you directly. And so what they do is they allow the federal government to capture that money from you in a federal tax, and then the states get it back to spend it. And then they take their cut too, by the way. Everybody's getting a cut of your money but you. Let me just do this math with you for a moment. In the last 5 years, we've added $8 trillion, $8 trillion to our national debt. That means we borrowed $8 physical trillion. We spent a whole lot more than that. But we actually added $8 trillion just to our debt, more than we made. So if that's the case, and you take a calculator and you divide $8 trillion by 300 million Americans, which is the total number of us roughly in the country, it's actually about 315, what you find is that we have spent or borrowed on behalf of every American somewhere close to about $25,000 or $26,000 per citizen. So if you're a family of four, we borrowed $100,000 in the last 5 years alone in your name. I'm going to ask you a question. Where is it? Have you seen it? I mean, I have a family of three. And I can tell you right now that I have not seen the results of $75,000 borrowed in my name. None of it's come to me. I get nothing for that money. I have not seen hide nor hair of the $75,000 that I am responsible to pay back. You, with a family of four, you have made yourself responsible for $100,000, but you don't have it. I mean, the truth is, every American in the United States of America should have $26,000 or $25,000 in their hand in the last 5 years, or $5,000 a year. Are you getting $5,000 a year? Have you seen $5,000 a year since President Obama took office? I'll bet money you haven't. So where did it go? I mean, who's got my 25 grand? Who's got my $5,000 a year? I mean, with a family of three, if I had an extra 15 grand a year, I could have done a lot with it. I could have applied it towards paying off my mortgage. I could have applied it towards, buying a better vehicle. I don't have any debt, really, other than a mortgage, and I refuse to get any, and you shouldn't either. If you're in debt, you're making a big mistake. But I can tell you that if I had $15,000 a year, over the course of the last 5 years, I could have paid off my home. I own it free and clear. I have no debt. I don't use credit cards. You shouldn't either. Where is that money? I haven't seen it. And by the way, that $8 trillion is on top of the fact that we already have we already spend close to about $3 trillion a year. We're borrowing the rest. I mean, do the math on that. That means we're spending $4.5 trillion and we only bring in $3 trillion. That's $1.5 trillion a year. And you are responsible for it, but you're not seeing the results of any of it. So when they tell you, well, we're going to cut the budget and we're going to actually trim this down and save you money, you know it's a lie because you're not getting any of it. You're not seeing any of that money, period. End of argument. You're not getting anything for that. If you were, you'd have that money to show. And right now, you don't. That's the shameful part of this whole thing. It's so far down the road of insanity that you got to wonder whether or not any of this makes any sense whatsoever. And when you hear these people tell you, you know it's all a lie. We'll be right back.
It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host. This is our third segment in today's show. We're looking at December 11th. And for the record, there are some meetings that are scheduled on this U.S. Park Service land grab that I want you to make sure that you're attending, including one tonight that's going to be held at the Powder Valley Conservation Nature Center in Kirkwood, Missouri. Now, that's at 6 to 9 p.m., and there is also one in Salem City Hall, and I'm not sure if that particular one is been canceled because of the weather issues, but that one's going to be held from 10 a.m. till noon today in Salem City Hall. So if there's any way that you can get there, please make sure that you do. I will be attending the one tonight at Powder Valley Conservation Nature Center if it's not canceled. And if there's anybody out there that knows that if they are or have not been canceled, please call me and let me know, or text me or something. Let me know what the story is. The truth is that this is a land grab that's being perpetrated on us by the National Park Service, where they're trying to basically control the rivers that the Ozark Scenic National Riverways, and it's a 20-year plan that will not work in our best interest. What they're essentially trying to do is eliminate 65 miles of horse trails. They're trying to block all unauthorized river crossings, which means they'll choose where and when and how you can cross a river. They'll require permits if you want a horseback ride. They're going to eliminate motor vehicle access to the gravel bars. They want to eliminate all ATV, UTV, and four-wheeler use, period. End of argument. There won't be any allowed. They want to eliminate motorboats in some areas and then reduce the power on motorboats in other areas. They say it's backed up by science, but they won't tell us what the empirical evidence is for that science. We're just supposed to trust them. And, in fact, we want to take it one step further. We want to go on the offensive and say, you know what, federal government, just give us the whole doggone scenic river national riverways back. We're just going to control it here domestically in our own state. We don't really need you. Because you come with, what? Strings. You got it. And remember that the federal government's goal is to tie everything back to them in one way, shape, form, or another, so that ultimately they control everything about you. And that leads me to our next topic, which is that the EPA, and if you haven't heard about this, boy, you better get on the stick, because this is ugly stuff. The EPA is proposing new rules that will allow them to take over private property and control all waters of the United States. All waters. Now, if you're a farmer, if you're a rancher, this ought to scare the living heck out of you. They actually have come out and said that this will benefit the economy if the EPA takes over private property. Well, no kidding, it'll benefit the economy of Washington, but it's not going to benefit the economy of your home. They want to extend their regulatory power over all waterways, over all wetlands, and they say that, of course, it will produce economic benefit. Well, let me tell you something. That's communism, socialism, and fascism. When the government owns everything, and you're told when and how and where and if at all you may use it, ladies and gentlemen, our founders told us that if the right for you to own property was ever taken away from you, you would be considered now a subject instead of a citizen, a slave instead of a master. The EPA wants to redefine the following term: waters of the United States. Now, what the current law says, and by the way, it's not a law, it's rules. Rules passed by an extra-constitutional administrative agency that doesn't have any basis for existence in the first place, legally. But the EPA has created these rules that say that all navigable waters are controlled by them. And by navigable waters, we mean, the major rivers, Mississippi River, et cetera, rivers that you can navigate on. But now they want to incorporate and expand that definition to include all, quote, tributaries, regardless of size and flow, and all lakes, ponds, and wetlands within a floodplain. Okay, stop right there. There's your key operative word. Tributaries, regardless of size and flow, lakes, ponds, and wetlands within a floodplain. Do you know that when they tried to do the blueways on us a few months back, the Army Corps of Engineers had just mapped out the brand new floodplain parameters. And in doing so, they expanded the floodplain to include the entire White River Basin. Now, in addition to that, that's what they were basing their blueways takeover on. This makes the blueways look like tiny in scope. This is going to give the EPA control over all water in the United States. If you have a creek on your property, if you have a dry creek on your property, if you have a pond, if you have any kind of wetlands, and by the way, they get to define what a wetland is, not you. You may not even think you have wetlands, but you do. And what they've done is expanded the definition of the floodplain. Now, they don't tell us whether they're considering that to be the 100-year, the 500-year, the 1,000-year floodplain. If you look at floodplain maps, they are created by the Army Corps of Engineers. They determine what a floodplain consists of. And they are marked out by year increments. So you have a 100-year floodplain, a 500-year, and a 1,000-year. And then you have intermediate increments as well. But those are the biggies. Now, the 100-year floodplain says that as close as this place is to a river, you can expect a major flood here every 100 years. A 500-year floodplain dramatically expands the size of that because it says every 500 years, due to geological changes and what have you, you can expect a major flood here. And then the 1,000-year floodplain says that once about every 1,000 years, this area here is going to get flooded, and it's usually a very big area. They want to use the floodplain to determine any tributaries, regardless of size, all lakes, ponds, and wetlands within those floodplains. But they don't tell you which floodplain they're going to use. And if you take a 1,000-year floodplain of the Mississippi River, ladies and gentlemen, it covers all the way from the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Other bodies of water, quote, such as geographically isolated wetlands, would have to be shown on a case-by-case basis to have a significant chemical, physical, or biological effect on large waterways downstream. A major point of concern for environmental groups. So here's what they're saying. Even water that is not, first of all, what they're telling you is that every stream and creek ultimately feeds into a navigable waterway. And so since those creeks, even when they're dry creek beds, since those creeks and ponds and streams all feed into the navigable waterway, they want control of that in order to protect the navigable waterway, which means they can get as far back from the Mississippi as, for crimini's sake, they can get into Kansas, for crying out loud. The truth is, Texas Republican Lamar Smith, here's what he has to say about this. The EPA's draft water rule is a massive power grab of private property across the United States. This could be the largest expansion of EPA regulatory authority ever. If the draft rule is approved, it would allow the EPA to regulate virtually every body of water in the United States, including private and public lakes, ponds, and streams. Wow. This is somebody who's actually in the government, who's telling you what they're intending to do. He's raising the alarm. Why is the media quiet about this? What have they been paid or promised? The EPA comes out and says that these claims are false. It's fear-mongering, they say. They're saying that the draft water rule would not expand the EPA or the Army Corps of Engineers jurisdiction or protect any new water that they have not historically had covered under the Clean Water Act. That's a lie. How do I know that? Because the environmentalists, the radical environmentalists, the extremist environmentalists, these are the people who want to turn Agenda 21, their map of America, into all red. If you've ever looked at an EPA map or in a map of Agenda 21, the goal of the Agenda 21 people is to turn about 70% of America into wildlife habitat in its raw and natural, unhuman contacted state. That means all of us got to go to the cities. Think I'm kidding? Go to my website at America's Voice Now and go take .org and go take a look and pull up some of those maps I've got on there. There's a search bar up there. You can type in Agenda 21 and there are a bunch of articles will pop up. See, the truth of the matter is, what we're really looking at here is another government agency that is exceeding its authority. In fact, it really doesn't have any authority. I want you to do yourself a favor. I want you to get a pocket constitution. I know you've got one. Somebody's handed you one recently sometime. And if you don't have one, get on the internet and read about it. And if you don't have internet, then go get a copy of one. Go to your library. I don't care. The truth is, if you don't have a copy of your Constitution, you're not doing your constitutional duty because you need to know it. But I want you to find anywhere in that document that gives the government authority to create administrative agencies and delegate the authority that's been given to Congress to pass all laws to some group of unnamed, unelected, no face, no name, completely untouchable bureaucrats. You see, the EPA, you didn't elect. Yet the Constitution says that only Congress may make law. So in order to get around that, the EPA says, well, we're not creating law. We're only creating rules and regulations. Well, okay. Let's play that little game for a moment. So you're going to create rules and regulations. Can I be penalized for failure to follow those rules? The answer is yes. Can I be financially fined? The answer is yes. Can you be imprisoned for failure to follow those rules and regulations? The answer is yes. Can you be taken into a court in order to be held accountable for violating rules and regulations? The answer is yes. The last question I have for you is, do I get a jury trial as required by the Constitution when I do go to an administrative law court? And the answer to that is no. Need I say more? If you don't have the jury trial, which is guaranteed to you by the Constitution, when you're in an administrative law court, and you're held in that court by rules and regulations that are, in fact, actual law, not passed by Congress, but passed by a nameless, faceless bureaucrat under the guise of a law, under the cover, the disguise of law, then, ladies and gentlemen, every administrative agency in the nation, with the exception of two, has no place in existence. Do you know what those two are? I'm going to tell you, but I'll give you 33 seconds to figure it out. Okay. The two that are allowed to exist are Border Patrol, because that is a federally delegated job. The Constitution states that the federal government is responsible for protecting our borders. So Border Patrol is a legitimate administrative agency. The second one, and the only other one that has constitutional authority to exist, is the Commerce Department. And the Commerce Department, not like the commerce that you're thinking of, but the Commerce Department has an existence because it is supposed to work with other nations to develop commerce between us and them. And at the same point in time, their job is to make sure that Pennsylvania doesn't charge Ohio a tariff that they don't charge to Virginia, let's say. See, that was the problem originally. They said, well, just because Ohio doesn't like Virginia, or just because Pennsylvania doesn't like Maine, doesn't mean that they get to whack them with a special tax. Now, the truth of the matter is, most of that issue has already been settled. And there's a couple of rules that could resolve that problem, or a few laws that could be passed, that would completely eliminate all of those issues. In fact, the Constitution very clearly already resolves them. But the Department of Commerce should exist, if only because constitutionally it's authorized. But it should stay within the boundaries of that which it's supposed to do. Now, they use the Commerce Clause, which is a whole different animal now. That's not the Commerce Department. They use the Commerce Clause to make everything and anything illegal. Do you know that you cannot own a firearm that has passed through interstate commerce if you're a felon? Well, no felon can own a gun, you say. Well, no, that's not entirely true, because the Second Amendment doesn't say that Americans can own firearms except for felons. What it does say is that you have the right to own whatever you want. The federal government, however, by using the Commerce Clause, has stated that anything that transpires in interstate commerce falls under them, which is why felons in possession of a firearm are always charged with federal law, and it's called the 922G. Now, I happen to personally know a guy who was a felon in Florida. From an earlier case when he was in his 20s, he got caught with some drugs. He became a felon. When he was 45, 25 years later, he had a pistol. He lived in Florida. The gun was made in Florida. It was made by Taurus. Taurus is based in Florida. When they caught him with the gun, they couldn't charge him with possession of a firearm under 922G, because that says that a felon cannot own a firearm used or purchased after interstate transit. Guess what? The gun never left the state of Florida, so therefore it didn't traffic in interstate transit. So you know what they did to get him? They got him for the bullets in the gun, not the gun itself. And they gave him a year for every bullet. 10 years. You see, they know that the Constitution and the Second Amendment portion of the Constitution is resolute. They know that it's as hard as granite. And so they have to figure out a way how to get around that. And they did that by utilizing the Commerce Clause. The other clause they use to great consternation and abuse is the General Welfare Clause. And if you want to understand what the General Welfare Clause and the Commerce Clause is meant, you got to understand and read what our founders wrote about that in the Federalist Papers, because those documents actually explained to the population of the country at the time what those two clauses meant. By the way, there's a great website out there that you can go to called federalistpapers.org, and I encourage you strongly to go there. They have a Facebook page too. The Federalist Papers, or federalistpapers.org. It's an excellent site. And they discuss different things about the Federalist Papers. They help draw them into some level of understanding for you. I get it. They're complicated and a little difficult to read sometimes because they were written in the language of our founders, which is not exactly how we speak today. But what you don't realize is that all of this stuff that is perpetrated on us, the EPA, the FCC, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Communications Commission, the DHS, right? The FBI, all of these agencies have no constitutional basis for their existence. The Environmental Protection Agency has no constitutional authority to exist at all in any way, shape, or form. And if you read what our founders say about things like that, they are very clear and specific. Any law that is passed that does not comport or align itself with the Constitution has no basis to exist, and it is null and void on its face. That means that all these laws and rules that we fall up underneath and really don't exist, but we agree to play by the rules that they've set anyway. Well, why would you do that? Why would America be willing to submit itself to the Environmental Protection Agency when it has no authority to act on behalf of the federal government or anything else? None. Now, I want clean water. I want air that you can breathe without dying. But we don't need the Environmental Protection Agency, which is full of fraud and abuse and cronyism, and trying to take control of literally the vast majority of private property in the United States of America in order to accomplish that. We don't need that. And we shouldn't be willing to accept that. The EPA is basing this entire concept of being able to, one, take over private property. Let me explain to you how this is going to work. If they get this ruling in place, you've got a creek that runs through your ranch. That creek, according to them, has a nexus, and this is the word they're using, a substantial nexus with a navigable waterway. So therefore, they can now say to you, everything that you do on this property affects that water, which ultimately, via its nexus to navigable water, affects that water. And so you're no longer allowed to run animals on it. You're no longer allowed to farm on it because the pesticides that you use in your farming will run into the water. Or if it's not the pesticides, it'll be the fertilizers. Are you starting to smell how this works? And over a relatively short period of time, they will be able to step in and via eminent domain, steal property from Americans. Or make it so worthless that you can do nothing with it. I watched an interview with a guy the other day who's been barred by the EPA from building on a piece of property. They're declaring that it's wetlands and that there's a special animal on there that only lives there. It's a frog. But by their own admission, in order for him to make the property compatible for the frog to live there again, which hasn't been found there in 50 years, he'd have to completely burn all of the trees down on the property. And yet they won't allow him to build on it, and it's not really suitable for the frog until he destroys the property. Go get the dichotomy of that circle. It makes no sense. We're going to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to talk about the police state in America and the tyranny of the militarization of the EPA and law enforcement in general. All right. We're back. You know, you've heard me talking about this militarization of police before. But every day there's another monster story out about how law enforcement is so far out of control at this point that they're ruling and they've actually become dangerous to America. Now, there's two stories in here I'm going to talk about today. Actually, three, but let's get on the first one just to get it out of the way. This takes political correctness to an insane extent, but it does show you the concept of how everything has become a police matter in the United States of America. There was a 6-year-old boy the other day who kissed a girl on the cheek. On the cheek now. He was a 6-year-old boy. He kissed a girl on the cheek, and the school is saying they're going to charge him with sexual harassment. Now, the boy says, it was during class, yeah. We were doing reading group, and I leaned over and kissed her on the hand. That's what happened. The school says, well, it's happened once before, and we need to teach him a lesson. So we need to charge him with sexual harassment so that it goes into his permanent record so that he understands that he can't do this. The superintendent of the school said, the focus needs to be on his behavior. We usually try to get the student to stop. But if it continues, we need to take action. And it sometimes rises to the level of suspension. The kid is 6. Here's what the mother says. This is taking it to an extreme that doesn't need to be met with a 6-year-old. Now my son is asking questions like, what is sex, Mommy? That should not ever be said. Sex. Not in a sentence with a 6-year-old. That's the and we heard the other day a story about a boy who drew back an imaginary bow and loosed an imaginary arrow and was suspended for criminal threat, terroristic threats against another student. I don't know, he's 6 or 8 years old. He had just finished watching that movie, whatever that movie is with the girl who runs around with a bow. And he went into school and he was playing around with his buddy and he went, wow, wow, wow. Next thing you know, he's suspended from school for terroristic threats, for an imaginary bow and an imaginary arrow. That, ladies and gentlemen, is where I'm talking about when I say that we have taken everything to a legal level. Everything now is a criminal matter. Here's a story, and then we're going to get into the main body here. This story comes out of New York State, in New York City, in Staten Island. This New York Police Department went into a woman's home, and they beat the family up physically. And when they were pushing the wife around, they knocked a bird cage off of a dresser, and then they stomped on the parakeet on purpose to kill it. They beat up the wife. They also beat 2 of her sons, her daughter, and another family friend. On September 2nd, 2012, they entered the home, and the family was celebrating Labor Day. The cops stopped outside the home, and they questioned the son because he was outside taking out the garbage. They asked him for his identification. He refused to show him any. And the officer grabbed his right arm, and the kid broke free and ran into the house. So the cops came, and they broke out the windows in the home. And when the woman opened the front door, she was thrown outside by the police. They struck the guy 2 or 3 times with a hard object, struck their friend in the face, and threw the woman into the dresser with the birdcage. Then the cops pepper sprayed her daughter and her son. The son, the daughter, and the family friend were all arrested, and all 3 were taken to Staten Island University Hospital. They were treated for, this is the family now, they were treated for multiple facial lacerations and lacerations to the head. The daughter was treated for an asthma attack. What could possibly have generated this kind of police brutality? Well, here's where the rub comes. The charges were all dropped against the family. But when the judge dropped them, he sealed the case. Do you know why? Because once the case is sealed, it can never be open to public view again. And they didn't want it. Now, look, if these people had done something wrong, they should have been charged, right? I mean, if there was real criminal activity on their part that authorized and warranted these officers kicking in the door, beating the family up, killing their pet, pepper spraying them and macing them in the face, beating them up, causing facial and lacerations on their faces and their heads, they should have been charged. But the judge sealed the records so that nobody could know. The city's law department will not say why the police entered the home last year. And they won't say what charges were lodged against the family but later dropped. They did say, well, we're reviewing the case. You see, the real problem here is that now everything and every part of American life has become a matter for law enforcement. There's a story out there on MotherJones.com. I'm not a big fan of Mother Jones, but there are times when I find an article that they do interesting. And I read a lot of stuff, you know? I mean, I read a lot of articles. And, you know, part of being a critical thinker is reading things from places that you don't necessarily agree with. I don't agree with most of what Mother Jones has to say about environmental issues and that kind of thing. They're very radical and very extremist. But I got to tell you, lately, folks, if you'll notice, it's not the conservative class of the political elite that is defending your rights to privacy and liberty and freedom and all those things. It's the left. And that ought to tell you something. What it should tell you is that neither the left nor the right are totally on your side. You're just food for them. You're livestock to be bought and sold and traded, milked, sheared, and occasionally, when your usefulness expires, culled. This story starts with a very, very interesting sentence, and I'm going to just give it to you because it really sets the tone. If all you've got is a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. And if police and prosecutors are your only tool, sooner or later, everything and everyone will be treated as criminal. This is increasingly the American way of life, a path that involves solving social problems and even some non-problems by throwing cops at them, with generally disastrous results. Wall-to-wall criminal law encroaches ever more on everyday life as police power is applied in ways that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. This is a worthwhile article. It's up on our Facebook page. It's up on our americasvoicenow.org page. If you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link to it in the section that's the description of the show. You got to scroll down. You know, hit that show more button, and it will drop that thing down, and you can see all the stuff I put in there. And on every program I do, I always put those links in there so that you can follow along and do. Because listen, my job is not to tell you what to think. My job is to give you enough seed that you can go out and plant it and grow your own crop. But I want you to be a critical thinker, and so you'll see me post things in there sometimes that will say, this is the opposite of what I was talking about in the program, but I wanted you to see it anyway. The problem that we have now is that the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on terror has become the war on America. We are consistently now the enemy. And you're the enemy for everything from your local police force as you're driving around town to the national government. You see, these items of war on crime, war on drugs, war on poverty, war on all these wars, first of all, ought to tell you right off the bat that when you have the term war, if you have a war on crime, That's a war on that segment of the population that commits crime. The problem is that most crime today in the United States is really not crime. It's rule breaking of some rule that shouldn't exist in the first place. I hearken you back to the segment I just did on the EPA. I mean, the crime of not wearing your seatbelt is not really a crime. It may be a crime to yourself because if you get in an automobile accident and you go flying through the windshield, it's your own fault. But it's not really a crime. If there's no victim, there's no crime. And that applies to drugs, and it applies to things like prostitution. You mean you support prostitution? No. I'm just saying it's not my place to tell you what to do. And if you and someone else choose to engage in that, it's not a crime because you're not affecting me. And you're not hurting someone else. See, under common law, the only time that you are actually responsible for a crime is when you have impacted someone else's property, possessions, value, or their rights. And who you sleep with is not my business, and you're not affecting my rights at all. How you do it and where you do it and what you ingest into your body. Listen, if you want to take ecstasy until your brain melts, that's up to you. I'm not responsible for your medical bills, by the way. I'm also not responsible for your medical bills if you choose to ride a motorcycle without a helmet. It's not my place to give you a ticket for doing so. But it's also not my place to say, and it's not your place to say I should pay for your medical bills. When you fall, as inevitably at some point on a motorcycle you will, and because you're not wearing a helmet, you crack your coconut and you want me to fix it. I'm not going to do that. That's your fault. You should have bought insurance. By the same token, if I'm not affecting you in some way, shape, or form, and I'm not demonizing your rights or injuring you in terms of property or revenue or value, then these issues are not issues. I don't support prostitution. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing for people to engage in. But it's not my place to tell anybody else what to do. It's only my place to decide for myself. I don't take drugs. But if you want to, you can. You should be allowed to. If you choose to do it in moderation and, once a month you sit down and you have a couple of beers with a friend or two and you smoke a joint, that's not my place to tell you yes or no, you can or cannot do that. It's not my place to tell you yes or no, you can or cannot do that if you do that twice a day, every day. If that's all you do, it's still not my place. But bear in mind, it's also not my place to give you food stamps. It's also not my responsibility to give you medical care. It's also not my responsibility to pay your rent. And it's not my responsibility to make sure that you've got heat in your home. If you are a chronic pothead and all you do is sit around and get stoned all day and you refuse to go out and find yourself a job and you refuse to participate in society, that is your fault. And you alone are responsible for your actions. See, that's the libertarian philosophy. And the truth of the matter is, if you look at it in its truest sense, it requires that you be, one, self-reliant, self-responsible, and self-governing. What do you mean by self-governing? Well, it's not my place to govern you. It's your place to govern you. It's your place to govern your own impulses. If you cannot control your animal impulse, that's your problem. But it's not mine. Nor will I pay for your blunders. You see, the vast majority of rules and laws that we have on the books today are not real crime. I mean, look, I'm all for taking somebody off the street when they commit a murder, when they commit a robbery, when they commit an act of assault. But don't tell me that these heavily armed SWAT teams who are kicking in people's doors, and these, the concept of handing a small town of 15,000 people an MRAP is necessary. An up-armored military vehicle to go serve warrants on somebody who's got a poker game going in their basement once a week. You got to be kidding me. Or you're going to go and do a no-knock raid to go in there and get, some kid who's got 3 joints because some stoolie gave you some information that was false. There's a book out there called The Rise of the Warrior Cop. It's by a guy by the name of Radley Balco, and I've read it. And I got to tell you, if you ever read Balco's book, you will be angry and frightened. You will be frightened because you'll recognize for the first time how far down this rabbit hole we've fallen. Now, he has a blog out there. I'll give you his web address because you may not be able to gain access to the book, but you can still find his website. He actually writes, I believe, for the Huffington Post, if I'm not mistaken. He writes articles from them from time to time. But he, if I can find his website. Anyway, my point is this. Do your own homework. It's Radley Balco. Radley is Radley, and his last name is Balco. B like Bravo, Alko. The problem that we have is that everything now has become a matter for law enforcement to deal with. Whether it's your 6-year-old who kisses the little girl sitting in the next desk over on the cheek because he likes her. Or whether your 8-year-old shoots an imaginary arrow from an imaginary bow at an imaginary opponent because he just watched a movie last night with the family about, how heroes use bows. The normal stuff that kids are doing in schools is being criminalized. And yet, when you look at what's going on in schools in places like the cities, these kids are out of control. I mean, they're threatening teachers. They're physically assaulting teachers. They're cursing at teachers, and they have there is zero discipline in schools. Until it comes to something like a kid who hugs another kid. I remember when one of my kids was younger, and I was in middle school, they had this thing where no student was allowed to touch another student. And, these days, kids will walk up and they'll give each other a hug and all that kind of thing. So what these kids would do is they would walk up and they would give each other what was the invisible hug. So they'd put their arms around each other but never actually physically touch. And I thought to myself, it was 7th grade or something like that. And I thought to myself, that's a little silly. But when we talk now about the fact that things are felonies for the most ridiculous stuff, and everybody is becoming a felon, the prisons are jammed full. We have the highest prison population in the world. We have 5% of the global population and 25% of the world's prison population. 25% of all the people incarcerated on the planet are right here in the United States. We have more felons in the United States than all the rest of the world combined. Why? You see, most of the stuff that people are being felonized for aren't real crimes at all. But what happens when you do classify someone as a felon? Well, all right. See, there really lies the crux and the answer to this conundrum. Why do they want? Well, first of all, if you do go into the prison system, that's an entire industry. It's like the military-industrial complex, but it's called the prison-industrial complex. There are an awful lot of people that make their living on law enforcement and the prosecution and the imprisonment and the blah, 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 blah. It keeps an awful lot of people engaged in work. Lawyers and judges and prosecutors and probation officers and prison guards. And I mean, there's an enormous, and not to mention the fact that a lot of prisons have work facilities there. In the federal prison system, they actually have a corporation called Unicor, which is a for-profit company, and all the inmates work there as employees. Well, not all of them. You have to actually beg to work there. And they pay you 12 cents an hour. And here's the problem. They make a profit. But guess what? The only stockholders are the federal pension owners, including judges, and they're all in the law enforcement arena. So it's the prosecutors and the judges and so forth and so on. It's a public company, but you can't buy the stock unless you're a judge or a prosecutor. And their only client, by the way, is the federal government. It's a rigged game. So what we have is a situation where, assuming for argument's sake that, all these law enforcement agencies, which constantly need more money, and then once they get you and nab you for whatever the alleged crime is, then they run you through the prison industrial complex system or the justice industrial complex system. Then when you get out, you got to go through the probation industrial complex system. And they got people watching over you, making you pee in a cup when you weren't even there for a drug charge. I mean, it's like, why would I pee in a cup? Well, everybody has to. Okay, but you didn't arrest me for drugs, so why do I have to pee in a cup? I mean, the absurdity of that is just beyond me. They're hoping that they can get you on drug with a drug in your system so that they can bring you back into the system. You get it? But here's the most important part of this whole thing. At the end of the day, what really matters is once they've made you a felon, you are prohibited from a lot of things in society, not the least of which is exercising your Second Amendment right. And to make matters even worse, not only are you prohibited from exercising your Second Amendment right, but everyone who lives in your household, because there can be no firearm in your premise where you live. And so if you're a husband and you've got a wife and you have a felony from back when you were 22 years old and you got caught with a half ounce of weed, and you're now 50, and you got a great job and you got children and you got, you go to church every Sunday and you haven't even gotten a speeding ticket in the last 15, 20 years, you're prohibited from owning a gun, and so is your wife, and so are your children. It's a way of applying a repeal of the Second Amendment without actually repealing it. And the threat of going to prison for the possession of that gun is the gun held to your head. The fines, extravagant. The problem is that now everything in the United States is become a police state matter. And that's why we now live in a police state America. It's the tragedy of militarization and the rise of tyranny. And make no mistake about it, that's exactly what it is. All right, we're going to wrap for the day. Do me a favor and do yourself a favor. Call the battery station at 303 Washington Avenue. And they are raising some goods that they need for the D Company 1-8 Cav Reapers stationed in Afghanistan. They send them packages every year. Call them at 417-257-7799 or email them at troops@batterystation.com and ask them what they still need donation-wise. They need baby wipes and stuff like that. These guys don't take showers for weeks, right? They need unscented wipes, and they need snacks and food and, foil tuna pouches and stuff like that. BatteryStation.com. You can email them troops@batterystation.com, or you can call 417-257-7799 and make sure that you're doing your part for that group. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Find us on the web at americasvoicenow.org and share it with your friends. We'll see you tomorrow morning bright and early.